opportunities. So we're going to be joined by some additional panelists in addition to the presenters that we've already met. So I'll quickly introduce them. Emma Slack is a professor at the ETH Zurich and the University of Oxford. She leads the Laboratory for Mucosal Immunology, and she's the Deputy Co-Director of the NCCR Microbiomes. Germán Bonilla-Rosso works at Agroscope and the Swiss Institute of Bioinformatics as a microbial ecologist. He's also a member of the Junior Editorial Board at EMBO, an open access journal of the American Society of Microbiology. And also Shawnna Buttery is the editor-in-chief at Cell Reports, the flagship open access journal for Cell Press. She has 11 years experience as a scientific editor. And among her work is that she was involved in launching STAR Protocols, an open access protocols journal from Cell Press in 2018 as editor-in-chief. Okay, so thank you everyone for being here, and let's start the discussion.
So as a reminder, I would like to ask people to post their question in the Q&A and not in the chat, because it's easier to pull the question out of the Q&A and ask you if you want to come on stage, if you want to ask your question. So thank you.
Okay, so I'm going to start asking the first question, and this is going to be directed to Shawnna and Bernd. So we've heard quite a bit about the funder requirements for publishing open access, and I'm wondering if the two of you could talk a bit about sort of the philosophical reasons for publishing open access. How would you convince somebody that this is something worth doing?
Do you want to start, Shawnna? I've talked already a lot.
Yeah, you're still muted. Yeah, you can. At the bottom of your screen, right in the middle, is your microphone. Does it?
So maybe Bernd, you can start.
Oh, okay, well, Shawnna's grab. Oh no, she's
sorry.
There you are.
I got it. Okay. Good morning. Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for having me. So I think I always think about open access as about author choice, and I want to support what authors want. If I did have to convince someone about, the benefits of open access, I think it would be about making sure your paper is readable to everyone. I think the reason that funders support open access is because they want to make sure that if they pay for research, the public that's paying for that research doesn't hit a paywall when they want to read the results of that research. For researchers, I think the benefits are that the open access articles tend to have more downloads and more usage than an article behind a paywall, which makes sense. The citations are slightly higher, but definitely not as much as the downloads and usage are versus a subscription article in the same sort of tier of journal. So I think those are the main reasons. I think, especially when I was at STAR Protocols, I think it was very important for me to have an open access journal, because I wanted to make sure that any researcher across the globe could go on Google and look for the protocol they wanted and find it, and then be able to access it without logging into their library, without looking for the subscription information, because we know that protocols are really something you want at the right time in the right moment.
Okay, I think that's covering most of the key aspects. I think, as particularly for publicly funded researchers, it's absolutely crucial philosophically, that the research is also available to all the taxpayers in principle. Although the reality is, of course, that this is so there's the fifth column in fifth column is the wrong word to use, but there's a big funding column in the EU that is around citizen science. So basically it's actually enshrined that any citizen should have access to the research output. In reality, we find very little of that actually access happening, but it is enshrined in the key funding mechanisms. So that's important, but also philosophically, I think we we all know that the wider scientific community, should have access to all the work. And I guess we've all been frustrated by clicking on a journal that we really want to read. As editors, we even have this all the time, that we get stuck and cannot open the paper. And people are then pushed. There's a platform called Sci-Hub, which developed just on the basis of this lack of access, and it's hugely popular and actually a big problem, because it's a legal site that's been pursued legally by all kinds of publishers and others, but it fulfills a massively important service, which is access to this crucial information. So by going open access, we basically obviate the need for all of these workaround methods of access.
Thank you. So maybe I can ask the question like from the researcher perspective, because Emma and Germán, you have been publishing in open access journal. And so I would be curious to know what motivates you actually to choose an OA journal versus a subscription-based journal. And maybe Emma, you can start.
Hi. Yeah, so can everybody hear me fine? This is my, yeah, perfect. I mean, for me, I think this was already from when I started in science 20 odd years ago. It was very uncomfortable, actually, to do publicly funded research and then put it behind a paywall. Right? I felt that from the very beginning of me doing science, there was something deeply wrong with that. So I was very happy when the open access movement started. And obviously, at that stage, we were going to libraries and opening books to find journals. So this is very different from how the setup is today. So for me, in many ways, it was a no-brainer to embrace this, because the work that we do and the information that we generate should be in the public domain. And I think the only barrier really is cost, right, to the scientists, for us, either for gold open access or for this, what the SNF calls green open access, right, where we pay for open access publication in journals like Nature. And yeah, so I think the motivation is very, very clearly there, and sort of, in my opinion, sort of fundamentally ethically grounded that we should be doing this.
So what about you, Germán? Because did you have to convince, maybe your PIs that you really wanted to publish open access, or is it something that you agree on? Can you tell us more?
Yes, so I did my PhD in Mexico, and Mexico is not a country that funds strongly science, especially for access for journals. So when I was doing my PhD, I really struggled a lot having access for journals. Back then, we basically had a network of PhDs distributed all around the world, where you would send a mail and then trying to find the papers if they were available or not. So for that part, like, I really think it's very important for the democratization of science that open access is really available for everyone to read, but also to publish. And that's one of the things that I still think that are a bit missing, because definitely 7,000 francs for a publication, it's you can hire someone in Mexico for a year with that amount of money. And yeah, the other part is like young researchers and also researchers in lower income countries. We don't really have much of a choice to select journals, especially based on APCs, but also because you basically get to publish wherever you can. Which is a bit of a shame, because that also means that lower income countries are much strained towards publishing, where you will have less readability as well. No? But since I've been in Europe, all the PIs that I know, we've always tried to be pushing towards open access. No? Of course, the other part is that when you want to get hired and have a position, many of the universities and the committees are still looking at big journals or luxury journals. So yeah, it's I don't want to say that open access is always the best option, because it might be that you still have to build the CV in the current environment, right?
Can I pick
Yes.
up a quick thing there? Oh, sorry, Julie. Go
No,
ahead.
no,
I
go
have
ahead.
one more comment quickly because Emma mentioned green briefly. So I think it would be useful to sort of really be clear what we mean by open access. You know, I think for me, it really has to be gold open access, because that is really the only way you have a version of record that is equally available to everybody, not sort of a half-baked, if you want, so a bit flippant now, but a sort of premature half-baked version that's available to those who can't afford the access, and the gold version available to rich countries. That it's also a matter of economics. So if you see at the cost of all the institutional repositories that are being set up in the United States to capture green open access, which are often not discoverable because they're just local repositories, it's probably huge. It's probably billions of dollars. And I would question if it's not much more efficient to have these on PubMed Central and discoverable, stable repositories instead. So I think we have to find a way to do global gold open access in an equitable way, as Germán very importantly emphasized.
Yes, but I want to come back to one comment you made, Emma. So it's like you are still publishing in let's say hybrid or transformative journals. So for which, like, in which circumstances do you choose this journal? And I mean, the obvious response is maybe because right now still the higher the journal with the most impact are transformative journal and not full OA. But is there any specific reason?
Right. So, I mean, where you choose to send a paper has many, many, many things behind it, right? I think open access is clearly only ever going to be one of those requirements at the moment. And yeah, I mean, the biggest thing is who you think is going to actually publish it. This is always our biggest barrier. It doesn't matter how much you're going to pay for it. If there's either no chance they'll publish or it's completely the wrong place. So I would say our decisions are still to a very large extent driven by what's in the paper and where we think it fits. Right, therefore we end up using this green option, which I absolutely agree is not worldwide equitable. Right, I'm sort of hoping this might be a transition towards a push from all of science to say, we demand that also the Nature publishing journals go proper open access, because paying twice is obviously a silly way of doing business there. But for us, I mean, obviously the other end of it that is important in our decision making is actually that most of my funding requires that we publish open access. And I am very aware that is good pressure. Right? I think we would have thought about it. I mean, now we've got into it, and we're with things like the PLOS journals, we've had very good experiences and are very happy to have worked with them, and would publish there because we have good experiences. But to actually get into that, I think this pressure from the funders is actually very valuable, and they have a big knife to wield on this topic, and I'm pleased to see that they are wielding it.
Thank you. Yes, Tobias.
I would like to jump in on the first question of and say that I actually don't see a question of whether or not open access. That is solved. So the idea of a subscription model continuing into the future, it was developed and useful when you send paper around. Then things became digital, so the point is moot. Everything will be open access. The question is, how do we organize this and sustain scholarly communication in the future? And a paywall is not part of that. So what is the benefit of a paywall to progress of knowledge in society? I don't see any. And I've not yet met a researcher that made a point for her content that should not be open access that made sense. There's a lot of legitimate criticism about business models and the way open access is implemented and performed that I'm happy to hear and discuss. But the main point of knowledge that has to be open, I've never met anyone in the research community who was against it. I want to add one more point to green. So content also being available on a public repository has more uses than just fulfilling an open access requirement. Bernd, you mentioned PubMed Central. Well, that has become such a big place because of a requirement that also made it possible that publishers directly deposit the content at that repository, which made it an invaluable source for knowledge in the fields it serves. I want to highlight that Europe PMC is even a better example of what's possible when secondary publication is put to use and open content is put to use. Because if you're interested in content that is also available from Europe PMC, in very many cases, when you visit their website and look at their services, they add value beyond just providing what is also available in the version of record from a publisher. But in very many cases, the service and the insight you gain from the way Europe PMC provides a paper is better than what the primary publisher is able to provide, because they can make the links to all the other content they have, irrespective if it's part of the portfolio of a publisher. And they can also text mine and add value beyond what a publisher is doing. So there are many reasons for secondary publication, for public repositories that collect the knowledge that was produced and add value to that.
Thank you.
And I think one thing I'm surprised that hasn't come up yet is bioRxiv and similar websites, where I find that a lot of authors are choosing to submit to bioRxiv before they submit to a journal, or they submit to bioRxiv before they go to a conference, because they want people to be able to see the full paper after they talk to them. And I think this is a great, it's also a signal to publishers and editors to say, okay, there is interest in this and we need to solve this problem. We need to find a way to make this work for researchers, because there's clearly interest in it.
Yeah, maybe I can pick up briefly on the preprints thing, because it's again where publishers and the community can cooperate to make the overall system better. So we are now doing what's called referee preprints. So whenever the journals generate preprints, we will post them as a service on the preprint, referee reports, I'm sorry. We'll post them as a service on the preprint version of those papers. And I briefly mentioned it's for Review Commons. That's the main output of Review Commons too. So, and the importance of that is it accelerates the process so dramatically, because there's so many preprints, it's really hard to navigate which ones are solid, which ones are not so solid. With 3 referee reports, it's much, much easier, and it allows Tobias at the SNSF to also hopefully evaluate those preprints in a more scalable way when he has 300 grant applications to wade through. So at EMBO now we have a policy, when you apply for a postdoc fellowship, that a referee preprint counts just like it would do for first author paper. So that's important. It was a challenge to get the committees to accept that, because they actually have to read. They can't just tick off the cell reports. Great, must be good. They have to actually look at the referee reports, but at least they have them to have a sort of informed judgment in maybe 5-6 minutes rather than 2 hours.
Do you want to hear from a researcher about preprints as well?
Well, so actually, sorry, before. Okay, yeah, sorry. Yeah, Emma, please go ahead. There's a question from Germán in the chat, but yes, Germán, you can absolutely ask questions. But let's have Emma go first because it's about preprints.
Preprints, yeah, exactly. So I think this is also, I absolutely 100% agree with everything you've said, that I think this is very, very positive. We really enjoy publishing the preprint because it's getting the data out there without all of the hurdles that are part of the publication process. So it's already there, it's already in the public domain. My colleagues across the world can access it and read it. They can form their own opinions. They know it's only a preprint, and we've had only good experiences with it. And also this the Review Commons system, I think, is a really useful, nice way forward, with also the possibility to then take those preprints to journals with the reviews, right? This is the central part of Review Commons, that takes a lot of the guessing out of which journal you're going to send your paper to in the first place. So I think these types of progress for us as scientists are something that we see very, very positively. I really have nothing negative to say about this. We still want to go through peer review, though. I think that's an important thing for us. I think that, you know, that these discussions that we could just have preprint repositories without, as you say, you know, really the formal, at least mainly formal peer review process. It seems that puts a lot of onus onto the scientists for finding useful information because there is so much on the preprint servers. So that's the risk I see there.
Okay, yeah, Germán, go ahead.
Yeah, and if I can also add on the previous question of what makes you choose open access, I would say that for a while it's not been really a question of whether or not you want to go to open access, but that we also need to consider something that Bernd mentioned briefly about open science. It's not only it's not a safe bet to have an open access journal only. No, I would promote or I would always try to choose a society journal, because then every the money that you're putting into that publication goes back to the scientific communities to organize events or to fund PhDs or to, I don't know, like as opposed to a for-profit journal, which well, their main point is making a profit out of that, right? So open access and society journals would be my first choice if possible, and if I have a voice in it always. Yeah, sorry, and I wanted to make a question actually for the rest, because last week, very, very timely, there was an analysis published by Paulo Crosetto about this strain. Like there is an exponential growth in the amount of papers being submitted. Everybody complains that there are not enough reviewers available, but the amount of PhDs awarded or researchers available for review is going down, which it could potentially threaten all these views of where open access is going, and I would like to hear what do you think about it. Thank you.
And actually, I would like to show a question from the audience. I will show the question on stage that is kind of related to what you are saying about like the extra work of reviewing. So this question is like from Matthias Holzmann saying, it seems that journal selectivity creates a large fraction of publishing costs as well as potentially extra reviewing work. Yet selectivity seems helpful to signal a work's importance to readers. So what could be ways forward to resolve this conflict? And it's kind of related of what just Germán asked. So it will be nice to hear your opinion here.
Yeah, shall I have a stab at it, or Shawnna, do you want to start? I don't mind. Shall I start? Okay. So I think that this is really the crux of the whole matter, and it's a really, really important discussion to be had. Because open access scales, the cost of it really scales with the acceptance rate, as was mentioned in the question. So why are we selecting? So it's really important. So there's two elements. So one is selecting for quality. I think open science is good because you're sharing everything, but it has to be curated, and it can mislead. We saw this in COVID, extremely misleading information being shared and so on. So the value of peer review, and actually much beyond peer review, curation exercises. So this research integrity screening, data integrity screening, all kinds of quality controls on top of peer review. I think we have to enhance that process rather than going the other way with just commenting on preprints, which is also valuable. So I think selectivity for quality, no brainer, but we select very strongly, and I think Cell Press will say the same, for interest of the work also on top of it. And that's, of course, the more sensitive issue. So traditionally, this has been the proxy for journal impact factors, for research assessment, relying on journal name because certain journals select for interest, which has been sort of what we're trying to address with DORA as a negative impact of that. But I still think there's a very positive element, which is stratification of information. I mean, we just mentioned exponential growth of knowledge. It's going to continue growing exponentially. So a single human brain simply cannot absorb this, and we need some mechanisms to help navigate this. And I'm really passionate about it, because we used to, so Emma mentioned going to the library, and there's a nice library behind her. So this is, when you get out a cellulose piece of work, you browse it. You just flick through the pages and you find stuff. And that's actually how I cloned the kinase that I worked in 3 decades ago, by browsing through nature, just leafing through it and seeing a related paper. So obviously, this is the olden days, but we haven't emulated that process in the online world yet. And this sort of coffee room type of science, where you chat to somebody, you don't know what you expect to find. You hear something really inspiring and you go for it. And that's the really discovery science. That's the most exciting. We haven't emulated this online yet. And this filtering is an important element of this. So AI will change all of this in a really dramatic way. So of course we can discuss this too, but I think for now, this filtering is an important service. But I would love to hear what others think, because it does make it super expensive.
And I think to go with that, I think to counter that, perhaps cost issue at the selective journals, we've tried to balance the portfolio at Cell Press. So we have sound science journals as well as the selective journals. And I think that's one of the ways we're going about trying to counter that, the cost that comes with the selectivity. I would also say that the reviewer pool shrinking versus the number of papers. I mean, I haven't read this article. I'm super interested. If you could share that link, Germán, I'd be interested in reading this. I've read something similar in the past, and it was basically the same people. We're going to the same people over and over again. It comes back to the fact that we're blindsided and we're not really being diverse in our thinking about the reviewers that were invited. And this is something we've really worked on at Cell Reports, especially in Cell Press broadly, to make sure that we have 20% of our authors that are from China. We should have 20% of our reviewers from China. And I think most publishers are like this as well, where they're predominantly going to American and UK and Europe-based researchers when we have a global audience of readership and authorship. So I think that's going to help us with the problem. I think the other thing is I'm curious to see how sound science journals like PLOS ONE or Helion or Scientific Reports are going to start dealing with this, because having 3 reviewers on every paper at that scale gets to be really hard. And I do wonder if a sound science model can be tested in a different way, that you can find, tools to look at the ethics of a paper and have it reviewed in a different way. And of course, Bernd mentioned the peer review commons. I think this is a super exciting way to really connect researchers with papers that they want to review. We did this at STAR Protocols as well. We called for volunteer reviewers, because we knew that, especially for protocols, there was a huge pool of people that were interested in reviewing and had the skills to review, but they weren't being contacted because they weren't a PI yet, or they didn't have an H index above X. And so I think there's an interest in that community that we're not getting to yet. So I think this story, the news is probably, I would not, disagree with the news, but I think there are ways that we can improve our reviewer selection process and stop biasing our reviewer pools and limiting ourselves. I think that will help us a lot.
Yeah, no, that's a great comment. Oh, Tobias, you also want to say something? I just want to have one quick follow on later. Go first.
Okay, so maybe the least popular, but I hope honest answer first: how to reduce the strain on scholarly publishing? Publish less. So the number of articles put out today might be beyond what is needed to communicate the knowledge within those articles. As long as the peer-reviewed item is the only valued output you can create, there is a inevitable incentive to publish as much as possible and put your name on as many of those items as possible, and the strain will not be reduced. So how to get around this? I think many authors today would also be happy to not publish an article, but be credited for another output they cared more about. A lot of people don't like to write articles. And if you look at attribution and the sections in an article where it's described who did what, that is also already a huge step forward. But I would like to see a future where we at the SNSF and universities, when they hire people, get better at incentivizing people to point at the most valuable contribution they actually made beyond publishing. The data set they curated, they spent all of their project time on making it as reusable and as good as possible. The piece of code they wrote and maintained even beyond the grant they were employed in. But this is obviously a cultural challenge. The first thing we saw when we at the SNSF introduced a narrative CV that required, that went away from the large publication list I mentioned in my talk and asked for the 5 most important outputs of a researcher. What happened in the panels? So if you went through one of those panel meetings when they were in person, the rare ones, and you saw the Google search screens and the full ORCID profiles of the people they were evaluating, because, well, it's useful for the reviewers. It's their proxy to do their job in the time they have at a, from their perspective, reasonable level of quality. So that's a huge challenge where we as a funder have a big responsibility to implement evaluation procedures that go beyond the peer-reviewed publication, but also to build the trust with grantees and applicants that if they make the choice in their proposal to highlight something else than a peer-reviewed article, that they won't get punished for it. And that's tricky. So there has to be a good balance between us promising that and also being able to deliver it, because we cannot influence the evaluation culture within the expert groups we have to rely on to arrive at a ranking of proposals in the end. For the near future, what Bernd proposed and what he showed with review comments and other approaches, detaching the review process from publication, I think is a great way forward in reducing waste. Because selectivity is extremely wasteful if reviews are done again and again and again. So that is I think a short-term aspect we all should work on to get away from 10 reviews with 30 reviewers involved for one article before it's published.
Yes, you made some really good points. Maybe I can quickly segue into this. I think Emma wants to say something too, but just briefly to pick up on this really eloquent way forward. I think, Tobias, I think the incentives are really important, that we valorize outputs that are non-narrative descriptions of data sets. I think we have to move really away from this idea that every complex data set has to have a human interpretable narrative description, this classical research paper format. We're swimming in this concept only because of this research evaluation process that we have. And once SNF and other funders have found mechanisms to valorize these other outputs, I think the system will flip really fast. And I think ultimately maybe we should publish only 30% of the current number of papers and everything else, but publish much more or post much more as sort of data preprints with minimal narrative format and instead structured discoverable data. But that has to be valorized. And I think the simple answer to this is we have to professionalize evaluation, research evaluation. And how do you professionalize it? By dedicating enough time for it. So ultimately, if it counts how good you are as a referee and evaluator for your own research progress, then you're incentivized to spend the amount of time it takes to evaluate these much more complex outputs, I think. And maybe one more point is on the really important point that Shawnna makes on liberating this order of magnitude more referees, which is sort of senior postdocs, which we're not going to right now. It's a huge number of really exciting and very, very smart people. I would really advocate that we move towards sort of a technical peer review level of assessment, which doesn't necessarily have to replace classical peer review, which is sort of senior people who have an overview, who can also assess a bit more of the interest and so on of the work. But technical peer review, where people only evaluate what they're really expert in, the data they're really expert in, they evaluate are the controls there, is it robust, is it reproducible in the way it's reported? And that would then apply to these data preprint sort of level of outputs. And that should be incentivized again, as we briefly mentioned, by counting how good you are as a referee, you know, in the SNF evaluation mechanism. So all this sort of coming together, that we have to sort of look more broadly in research assessment at these new mechanisms of evaluation.
So Emma, do you want to comment on that?
Yeah, increasingly long list of things I'd like to comment on, but so that I try and do them in the order I was thinking of them. So I think that the comment about research assessment is very well taken, and I think the challenge there is that we need change. Not, you know, if we just change this in Switzerland, or even if we just change this in Switzerland and the UK, scientists are fully international and fully mobile, and we need this to be international, right? As long as China or India are still only evaluating on the number of research publications, then it's not going to change anything. And I don't know how we achieve that, but I think that's going to be critical. That the response is not just from Europe and North America, but is really an international effort. I think one of the topics that was briefly mentioned was AI, and I'm interested how the publishers are dealing with this at the moment. So obviously this is all very, very new and very exciting in some ways, and potentially offers benefits, but certainly also offers risks. And I think one of the points Tobias was saying about publishing less is of course true of actual science, but paper mills are an issue here. And if you have AI for paper mills, this becomes a very, very efficient way of producing nonsense. So I was just wondering, as questions to the, unfortunately we seem to have lost Bernd a second. So I guess he hasn't heard the question, but maybe then to Shawnna, of how the journals are sort of dealing with this at the moment, and how you're planning to move forward. I also wanted to open a discussion a little bit about ensuring quality of peer review, because I think that's one of the efficiency issues. But maybe we start with AI.
Yeah, so many interesting points here. I'm having the same problem. Like, oh, I want to say. Okay, but the AI thing. So the projects I know about at Elsevier and the broader company with AI, one thing we're using machine learning AI for is really helping authors find the right journal for their work, especially after they've been rejected. I think that's a really nice project that we're working on. I think the other thing, and this is really just in the beginning stages to what I know, and that is finding out if we can use AI for ethics, finding out if we can use AI to detect paper mills. Now, I think this is a much bigger issue. And I think as with any machine learning, right, you can have a bias, and then you're going to have a human intervention to make sure you're not rejecting papers solely because the machine told you to. And so I think there's definitely a lot of concerns there. I've seen things where the score for the Authenticate score, where it's basically looking at plagiarism when it's been posted on bioRxiv, and if a machine were sorting those papers, it wouldn't say, okay, this is on bioRxiv, this isn't real plagiarism, right? So, but I think that's the thing we have to be mindful of. So I don't know if that answered your question.
Mm-hmm. Oh, thank you. That's interesting. So then maybe can we follow up with this quality of peer review discussion?
I would like to answer the question here, to challenge a bit what was just said, because basically, and it was Bernd and Tobias and Shawnna, and to come back to open access a little bit, because we were talking about the struggle of finding reviewers because there are many more papers. And Tobias, you were saying you need to publish less. This will address some of the problems, and yes, I agree. But at the same time, I think it's a little bit, and I'm sorry, hypocrite from the publisher sides, because and I was an editor, so a publishing company are launching more and more journals actually. Like over the last years, there have been a ton of new journals at Cell Press, at NPG, also Science over the last years, to actually, and OA journal, full OA journal, to compensate the cost of switching from a subscription-based model to a full OA journal. So then it's like, okay, we are struggling finding reviewers, and it's a burden. And even if we acknowledge their work, you know, like this is great, but still, like, isn't it like a little bit opposite? Launching more journals, and at the same time we said, but we have a problem finding reviewers. So I mean, Shawnna, Bernd is not like, we're trying to reconnect with him, but maybe I put you on the spot here to answer.
No worries at all. I do find it interesting, and I think, you know, if we look at the transformative journals, the journals that were subscription, that basically opened up as hybrid, and has there been enough uptake yet for those to really switch to full open access? And I think the answer so far is no. And I think that's because, you know, the price and then the funding isn't there. I hear from a lot of researchers that they want to publish open access, but the costs are too high, and the funding bodies they have don't support quite the cost of the level of journal that they want to publish in. So then they have to make decisions about where to publish. So I think the other issue with, you know, launching more journals, I think we launched journals at Cell Press and Elsevier in response to researcher needs, in response to what we're seeing in the market. So if we're seeing growth in the market, then we will launch a journal in that space, because we want to make sure we capture that. We want to make sure we're competitive with Nature, Science. But I think we also want to make sure authors have choices across our publishing house of where they can publish. Finally, I think, as you very well know from your time at Cell Report, Julie, we share information across Cell Press journals. So the information, if you transfer from Cell or to Molecular Cell, or Molecular Cell to Cell Reports, those peer review comments get transferred with that. So we don't lose that information. So at least within our publishing house, and I'm sure it's the same at Nature, at the EMBO journals, when you transfer, that information comes with it. But I will say that these programs like the preprint review program, I think, is a really great way. And I've been surprised that more people haven't taken it up yet. I think it's, you know, these things take time, and researchers are, in my view of, you know, doing user research for STAR protocols, I find that researchers are surprisingly conservative about things. I think they just have too many places that they have to be creative and innovative. And so when it comes to publishing, they are a little bit more conservative. I think some of the stories that Tobias was saying about, you know, these narrative CVs and adapting to that, it's hard to adapt and change when you've done something for so long. And that's why doing these experiments to really help researchers get there is something I'm excited about.
Thank you.
Okay, so I'm really interested in this idea of data sets as a research output, as like an alternative output, and it's something that Bernd touched on, but also Emma talking about preprints as a way of getting your data out there, and it's too bad that Bernd has dropped off, but I wonder if we could have a little bit of discussion about, like, how could peer review of data work. Bernd mentioned that they have a single data curator on staff, and I'm interested to know, like, what that person does and what level of review they provide. So Shawnna, I actually don't know. Do you have any experience with any of these issues, or?
So I will say, I think this is a fascinating idea, and I've been on several panels where they're talking at NIH or HHMI about how they can make an article really three-dimensional, four-dimensional, where it's linked to all the data sets and all of the bits that really went into making the data. And I think that would be really exciting to see where that goes in the future. And I think if you want peer-reviewed data sets, we do offer a suite of journals at Elsevier where you can publish your article and then submit the data that went along with that article, and that will be peer-reviewed separately. I think the growth of that journal, those types of journals, have not been as robust as we might have hoped. Sorry, I have a cold. And I think that might be a signal for the fact that, you know, maybe there's not as much interest in that, and there's no, you know, benefits for that at the way the current systems are. The current, sorry, I have to cough. I'm done.
Okay. Yeah, and Emma, do you have any thoughts on how? Yeah, I mean, if you talk about, having a preprint, sharing your data kind of ahead of publication, I mean, what are your thoughts about sharing? I don't assume that most peer-reviewed papers also have peer-reviewed data with them, but yeah, if you could just talk a bit about your thoughts about that.
Right. So, I mean, I guess we always upload the data with our papers, either, actually with the journal itself or in a research collection, one of the standard data banks. What I have to honestly say is that when I get a paper for review, I will tend to review the figures in the paper and not to have time really to go in and reanalyze the data as a peer reviewer, right? That's currently, as that system stands, I don't have enough time to do that. It would take weeks in most cases. So I think in terms of sort of peer reviewing the data, what can be relatively quickly done is checking that the metadata is in, right? Checking that the reusability criteria are actually met, and that it is good enough quality data to be reused, but without really making peer review a much more solid paid job effectively. It's going to be very hard to really peer review, people's massive sets of single cell transcriptomics data as part of the peer review process. I don't know what others think about that, but to me, that's like a big ask.
Actually, if I can, this is actually a problem because, as Tobias was saying, if you want to consider data set as a research output, in addition to publication and other research output, and then now you are saying these data sets, are not reviewed properly, that I totally understand, when it's not like you are going to reanalyze every piece of data, then it's really a question how we really trust data, and do we should give weight when we evaluate a researcher to these data that have not been properly peer reviewed. So I'm curious to hear opinions here.
Mm-hmm. And I mean, reuse is obviously a good peer review case, right? But that's not something we necessarily keep track of currently.
Exactly. But I think that's one tool that I would love to see, or one metric I would love to see attached to papers. And I think funders have been really interested in this as well. And that is kind of a reusability index or a reproducibility index where, this data set is in paper X and it's been used in paper Y and Z. And that sort of number is somehow in the information about the original paper. And I think that's probably more useful than having a peer reviewer looking at the data set. I think, to me, it makes sense for the peer review for data sets to be, it was used in a paper and it's findable and it's formatted in a way that's consistent, that other people can use it later. I'm curious to hear what you're saying.
I mean, one issue, just to add a caveat. So one issue, the reason why people don't look at, so the proxy for this is citations to papers, right? And the reason people don't look at citations but impact factors is it's prospective. So when you apply for grant, you're trying to look at the future potential of often quite young scientists. And so the work hasn't had the time to mature to allow reuse, right? So this is a conundrum that is really hard, and that's why it's even hard to wean ourselves off journal impact factors, because they have this sort of super high attraction of being pseudo prospective, or they claim to be prospective. So yeah, but I think reuse is a really good one. I still think at the technical peer review level, we can automate a lot of this stuff going forward, also with AI technology, and it has to be a combination of machine and expert humans that have to be incentivized. I totally agree. Again, I would say payment of those people is one possibility, but I would say the more valuable is if it counts, if we have mechanisms to measure how good they are as open science evaluators, basically, and build that into Tobias's system.
Germán, did you want to talk about this?
Yes, I think one of the we should question if the data. So I work in bioinformatics and genetics and genomics, so we deal with this all the time, and I think one of the problems is to still think that the data that you generate is only associated with a publication, because it has been already acknowledged. I think the European Union and also the SNF have already done research on this, that one of the big bottlenecks for the advancement of science is still sharing data and making it reusable, and we do not really have the infrastructure that can guarantee that the data that we produce is entirely shareable and of a quality that guarantees that it can be reused by people in other places or in the future itself.
And sorry to follow up on something that Shawnna was talking about like data being reused and maybe citing a data set. When I brought up that possibility to one of my colleagues in the NCCR, he was just mentioning that like the number of people who might reuse your data set is probably going to be very low. And in the current system, you need hundreds of citations to show that your paper is really of high quality. So even if 10 people cited your data set, which to me would be a lot, that wouldn't compare to how many citations you need to be kind of recognized. So I guess you would just have to give a different weight to a citation of a data set than just a journal article citation.
So I'm not sure I totally agree with that, actually, because a narrative-driven paper looks at one angle of a complex data set typically, and of course you get some citations to that and so on. But a data set is much more than just that one interpretation. So I think there's a potential, and we see this with some of the highest citing papers. Even they tend to be techniques papers or sort of data set papers in nucleic acid research or wherever, And so I think it's not so trivial to know what's being cited.
May I also add to that of course we have to recalibrate how we assess quality or attention for a piece of research, again, when it comes to different pieces of research. So the citation won't be the same. Even citations also don't translate between disciplines. My sociology article will never be even remotely as cited as anything in the life sciences. That's a reality that won't change. But also, when we look at data, we must not only look at data sets associated to a publication, because then we import, again, other issues like confirmation bias. And I would really like to see particularly that data sets that were produced and did not confirm the hypothesis, because they are also a result and they have the potential to prevent secondary, tertiary analysis into the same topic again. So that's really valuable insight. And one point that I find curious is in research, we work a lot on trust and on unspoken rules governing what is fine and what is not. So if someone wants to fake a data set and put this out as a valuable result and get grant funding based on that, and there is no review that picks up on it, this is hardly an issue we will solve. But that person obviously runs the risk of ending the career by doing so, because that's blatant misconduct. And we operate on this principle of trust in very many areas. So do we really need a review that ensures every data set is genuine? Is it possible to implement such a thing? Is it worthwhile to spend the resources on such a harsh controlling in the end, or isn't the community itself able to do so? If the researcher in this hypothetical scenario I was drafting, when she applies for SNSF funding, if she mentions a data set as a valuable output of her past work, I don't think it will be done in just linking to the data set and saying it exists, but adding some more narrative to it, because that's the whole point of a narrative CV in the first place. The publication can stand by itself because it's the narrative, as Bernd just mentioned, but a data set or other units won't. They need more explanation behind it, and they get stronger if that researcher, for example, was able to get someone else interested in the data set. That would also be a valuable contribution to science, not to produce just the output and let it lie around somewhere, but really pointing to it in her networks, even maybe finding someone who could make use of it, and then show that there was attention for it and what came out of it. So my point is, in many cases, we won't get around trust, and we shouldn't try to get around trust.
Maybe one comment on that. So that was really well put, everything, I think. But one comment: our refereeing process does not really evaluate, to be honest, the authenticity of data and so on. I mean, we take it on trust that it was generated legitimately. We're adding quality control mechanisms to do sort of forensic analyses of, you know, if data are genuine as best we can, and that ship is sailing very rapidly with AI. By the way, it's actually very hard to pinpoint issues. But you know, the value of peer review is to see if the data was generated is of high quality, is sort of if the controls are there, if the experiment was designed properly and stuff like that, rather than seeing if it's authentic. I think that's a different level of analysis where the trust is important. But I think peer review is really important to see. I mean, there's good science and there's bad science, and we should not sort of beat about the bush. There's also many tax dollars wasted in really useless science that is of not reproducible and not useful to anyone.
Yeah,
and you know, yeah.
Oh,
sorry, no.
I would just venture to say that the state of published data now is, you know, the reason we might need peer review is not really to separate, like, are these good data, are these authentic data, or are they completely made up? It's more to catch, you know, data that are not reusable because they're not well annotated, because they're not well described, and so forth. And so, you know, I think what you're talking about, Bernd, about, you know, having somebody just check the quality of the data may be sufficient. Okay, so to change direction, but to kind of bring us back to this question of financing. So Bernd, from a publisher's point of view, is there anything that can be done to decrease the APCs and maintain the viability of publishing companies?
Well, so I touched on a couple of things, right? So one is the on the for-profit side, it's called profit. On our side, it's still called surplus. So you know, a good fraction, 22.5% for us is surplus, which we reinvest fully in science. But that could be lost and change, you know, invested directly into our postdoc scheme, for example. So that would decrease them 22.5%. The other thing is, you know, there's certainly ways that Shawnna mentioned this, the transfer mechanisms between journals. We can go beyond silos. So, for example, we've just started to launch a transfer mechanism that goes beyond our own little bubble silo to include nature journals. So that's really important to increase the overall efficacy of the process. And we, you know, the outcome has to be one set of referee comments on one research paper. That's serial peer review is, and that's a huge cost. It's a cost of time to the research community, but also to the editors, because every time we have to ask, you know, to get a panel of 3 referees, we have to actually ask about 15 people, or at certain journals, even 30 people. And that's a completely inefficient process. So there's certainly a whole bunch of mechanisms to reduce costs in the system further. But on the other hand, we're increasing costs by doing curation, ethical checks. So we touched on research integrity. We see massive problems because the system is pressured. Do we, and we have this challenge now, do we drop those activities because many other journals are not doing them, because it would decrease our costs? And we've calculated this by about 2,000 euros. Just if we dropped all the, you know, bells and whistles, if you wanted. But is that a service to the community? We really don't think so. So we don't want to drop those. But, you know, that could be one way to decrease the thing. And then the third thing I mentioned, and I would really like a discussion on this, the stratification by interest, you know, by the journals. If we increased our acceptance rate to publish all high quality science, or, you know, of a certain level of interest, let's say, our acceptance rate would go up to about 20% or even 25% from the current 10 to 15%. That would decreased proportionally the APC, pretty much directly proportionally. But I still think we're providing a service doing this. But if the community feels it's not a good enough service, then we should stop it.
Shawnna, would you like to also answer this question from another publishing company point of view?
Yeah, this is a really tough question. And I think, we've seen, I think EMBO published this, eLife has published the actual cost per article, and it's really fascinating to read. And I think a lot of journals are really, offering options that are well below that cost, right? So not, putting the publisher in surplus or profit. I think the other thing I was thinking about, no, it's really escaped me. Sorry. Sorry, come back to me.
All
Well,
right.
what about the selectivity thing?
Yes. Go ahead, Bernd.
Well, I just, it'd be great to get comments also from Shawnna, but also from the research community about the selectivity.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, that was the other thing I wanted to say. Yes. So one thing, and I think publishers have experimented with this, is submission cost. What if we charge for submission rather than charge for publication? And I think there was a lot of pushback to that, understandably. And I think that has to do with the fact that publishers aren't showing the value of what we're doing. And I think the value of what we're doing is exactly what Bernd said, right? We're helping cultivate it. We're helping to, make it into a much better product than what it was to start because of the peer review process. We're helping it to be findable. But yeah, I'm not sure about, how we can really decrease the costs. I think one of the ways is by publishing more sound science options at reasonable price points.
So just one quick comment. I think that's great that because we hadn't covered that. That's a really important way, of course, to scale immediately, to get the acceptance rate out of the equation. One way to do this that could work, but we're too scared to do it, to be honest, is to take out the submission fee when you accept the paper out of the APC. So then it's basically then a gamble. If you're confident about your work, there's no change to your costs. But if you're, for all the people that are just trying it out for the sake of it, they cover the cost. But we're too scared to do it, to be honest.
And I think we've also talked about models. Oh, sorry. We've also talked about models where your APC, we're thinking about this in the context of a consortium where we're inviting papers in or we're making an agreement with people to publish with us. And would it be one cost regardless of what journal they end up publishing in? And it would be like an average cost for all of those. But again, it's still, it's still going to be a cost, and it's probably more than most researchers would like.
Yeah, from the researcher side, maybe you can comment on it. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I would see a real fear with cost to submit that gives the predatory journals a huge benefit. Right? And that's already a problem. And, they can very easily send nice emails saying free to submit compared to, all of the big publishers that are going to charge you. And I'd be pretty worried about that. I've forgotten the other point I was going to make now. I've been distracted. Okay, come back to me. I know Germán had something to say.
Yeah, thank you. Yes, I think that especially from the younger researchers, I think that there is there is a change with the perception of I haven't measured it. This is just like anecdotal, but there is a change from they would like to see like the metrics or the impact of a paper measured on the paper itself, and move away from the prestige of the journals themselves, right? Like, because as everybody knows, there are really bad papers published in Nature and Science, and really good papers, highly cited, high impact, published in other journals that are not these luxury ones. So I don't know if what is the point of view from my side? I know that I've had papers that have incredibly improved because of the comments of the editors and the reviewers, or that have been benefited from the machinery for advertising that they have. They really increased the visibility of my papers, but others were, well, it was not very evident what was being done behind them. So I wonder what the publishers think about this.
I always say that I love my job, but if universities and funders tomorrow decided they're not going to make decisions about promotion, tenure, and funding based on impact factors, I would be happy to find another job. Like, it would stink, but I'd be happy that the system solved this problem. I'm not a huge fan of impact factor. I think I try not to talk about it because I think, it has all these problems associated with it. And at which, I think has been talked about at length. But I think what's frustrating as an editor is that these problems aren't just the journals, right? The other problem that I find interesting is that when an author becomes a reviewer, suddenly they kind of forget that they're the same person. And an editor on my team, an author is complaining about a reviewer, and then the next week they come back as a reviewer and they have the same sort of nitpicky questions. It's like the call is coming from inside the house. Like we are making our own trouble. Sorry, now I'm getting a little.
Dr. Jekyll, Mr. Hyde. Yeah, go for it.
Can I jump in, because that was sort of the point I was going to make before I forgot who I was and what we were talking about. That many of us learnt publishing and peer reviewing from our PIs in the lab we happen to be in. Right? There's very little, depending, I guess, on where you are, but at least in my experience, the route I came through, there's very little formal teaching, and certainly nothing coming from the journals of how to be a good peer reviewer, how to write to get your work published. That there are little courses, but everybody has their own opinion, as everybody in science have had some deeply offensive peer reviews sent back that are completely not useful, and some that are utterly brilliant and have made the paper and the work massively more valuable. And if we could come up with a system, that you have a license to peer review almost. And I know you're saying we haven't got enough peer reviewers, but that would then make it a desirable place to be, rather than some free work we have to do for somebody else. Yeah. So to make it a valued, that and also for the scientists then to be more of a guarantee that you're going to get a useful service. And that would also be a possibility to teach the scientific community what the purpose of journals and editors is. What are you doing for science? Because I think, as you say, it's quite intransparent a lot of the time. We're not appreciating the amount of work that goes on behind the scene to get, what we think is just similar to dumping our preprint onto bioarchive. So I think there is a potential for some education in here to solve some of the problems.
So
can I just make a
go for it?
Just a very brief promotional comment, but I am part of the EMBO journal editorial board, and that's actually trying exactly to cover this gap, right? Like, it's a 2-year program where you actually are tutored and assist the seminars and get some guidance on peer review itself, of course, under the views of what ASM and EMBO thinks about what peer review should be. But I think it's a very good experience, and if anyone who's listening is interested in this, the new round for the board is closing the 31st of October. So just have a look at it, EMBO Junior Editorial Board, and you will find the call. Sorry.
Yeah, so no, that's great. So the mentorship approach is really good, as Germán just noted. there's also a way to make this scalable at the peer review level, and that we found super successful, which is what we call cross-referee commenting or consultative peer review. So basically, the referees are all commenting on each other's reports, and more journals are doing that. And that's a great way to learn on the job, essentially, how to do it properly. We also have very good experience with more structured peer review, which we are increasingly using. We are developing an AI tool to actually call out sort of politically motivated language and so on as a basic refereeing tool, so that people, they often don't even notice in the rush that they're going off piste with their Mr. Jekyll comments, and the next day they turn to nice people again. So this is there's all kinds of mechanisms. I mean, training, as you mentioned, Emma, that is provided by various institutions, including ours. So, but I think ultimately the thing, if we start to valorize peer review in research assessment formally, then people are incentivized to spend the time. I think one thing is the accreditation. Basically, that's one mechanism, but the other one is simply, if it matters for your own career that you are an expert constructive referee, then it will change.
And one thing, this is something I've been really recently looking into, is how other publishers are working in the space of incentivizing peer review. And I would think, I know there were some publishers that were working on this model that if you review for us X number of times, we give you a credit to publish with us APC on your APC. And I need to find like how successful that was, because it sounds like a really nice model. Because one of the ways that I go to find reviewers is I look at the authors for Cell Reports and related journals at Cell Press, because I know that they're likely to review for us. But I should also give a plug that Elsevier has an abundance of free resources in Researcher Academy. You can do trainings, you can get certification as a peer reviewer. And this is what we used at Start Protocols. In addition, we used kind of a formatted peer review process where people could comment in line on the protocol, because we thought this was really the format to experiment with that. And then finally, we used a ranking system, a very simple kind of ranking system after we looked at the peer review comments to see, did they follow the instructions? Did they have timely comments? And were they useful comments? And I think those three things kind of together were helping us really experiment in that space. And I'm hopeful that we'll be able to, use some of those top reviewers from Start Protocols and incorporate them into the rest of the Cell Press journals.
So we have a couple of questions from the audience about the cost, and I'm going to show the question on stage. So this first question from Konrad Lagoda is like, would an open review process like enabled by scienceopen.com help tackle the cost issue? So who would like to comment on this?
I can have one quick stab at it. I think whoever administers peer review is there's an overhead to that, and it's quite a lot of heavy lifting to do it properly. Now a free, there's various mechanisms. The one that was mentioned of Faculty of 1,000 Research, where you self-nominate your referees. eLife is experimenting with new mechanisms. There's all kinds of things that are done, but I think quality peer review at the end of the day is heavy lifting with a cost overhead. It doesn't have to be done by journals, but it's to do it properly will cost almost the same wherever it's done, I would say.
And we also have Tobias.
Can I
Yes.
jump in on the cost question, not directly to Science Open, but when I hear there's a surplus of 20%, rumor has it that the Elsevier profit margin is in the area of 30% for decades now. That is not a law of nature. So getting that surplus, getting that profit out of scholarly publishing, so out of distributing a product that was in the vast majority produced by publicly funded researchers, I think that's up for debate, and that can change. Another thing that I find very curious in this publishing landscape is that we treat it like a market, which it isn't. So an APC is often treated as a price, and price implies that I could change an alternative. But in many cases, I cannot. And an APC, the most APCs I see and the level at which they are set are not targeted to cover the cost of publishing plus a small profit, but they are aimed at extracting the most money out of the system as is possible for a given journal. So the transparency Bernd has shown for EMBO is a huge exception in the publishing landscape. How transparent you are as a scholar, as a society publisher. From my point of view, I cannot recall any other example that's unheard of, being that transparent and making it clear what costs how much. Coalition S has tried to implement something like that at a far less detailed level, the journal comparison service. But transparency, when we talk about costs, will become very important in the future because the system will not bear the level of spend that is at the horizon. If we think about one of the questions that was posed, if we transform all of the publishing today into an APC world, is it sustainable? No, it's not. Not for the SNSF, not for the Swiss higher education institutions, not for anyone at the level of APCs we see today. If they are linked to the cost of the services that are actually provided, and that is the bigger challenge for us as the public research side, if researchers actually feel that they have a choice where they can publish and don't feel forced to get their content into very select channels, then maybe we can talk about a market where there's elasticity in there. But right now, that's a big issue.
That's great that you started to comment on this. I think that's one thing that would be fun to discuss because we've been thinking about this too. So what if there was a baseline charge for the basic service of peer review and so on? That would be in the order of a couple of thousand of dollars. But then as a funder, so there would be sort of add-on services that you could opt into and they would be charged separately. So if your funder wants you to do proper open science research, you buy into the curation basically effort that was done by the journal, but you pay extra for that. Would that be something that the SNF would be interested in? So that it's very hard to administer these multiple, complex costs. I call this the sort of the Ryanair model of publishing. You buy in the extra services, but that's certainly a way to stratify the costs too. Is there any appetite for something like that?
So I understand it as disentangling the services you provide and making it modular. Well, if there is an interest from the researchers, so if this diversification fits the needs of the people who want to use your services, that's the most important point up front. But being able to choose or leave something on the table, we do this already when it comes to book publishing. There we have a completely modular approach where it's a base price and additional services based on what the authors need. So that makes sense also from a funder perspective.
Yeah, I think the problem with the author's needs, it's complex. I showed you some data we have that people don't feel they need open science at all because they just want to get an impact factor paper out. They also don't think they need the research integrity check, right? Because ULab, of course, cannot be possibly doing anything wrong. So I think it would have to be funder mandated that you say, for an SNF grantee, we expect you to do this and this and that to publish your work, open access, but also open science. And we provide extra money for that. That's the sort of the funding mechanism I touched on. So this sort of partial diamond, if you want, concept that certain aspects of a high quality journal process are funded separately to the baseline activity.
Well, that's a difficult question to answer right now. Also, if it goes into questions like research integrity, those are things we require our grantees to do and fulfill, and it's not something that can be provided by a third party.
And I'm interested to know, Bernd, could you explain a little bit more what your check is for research integrity?
Oh yeah, sure. So it could be much more, and Shawnna I'm sure can comment on this too, and Germán. So basically, what we do, so our main focus is at two very simple levels, which is image integrity, where we see a huge number of problems, which range from simple mistakes, massive number of 17%, to outright fraud, which is about 0.5% of post-review papers. Then we do, of course, classics of plagiarism type checks and so on, which is becoming very complex in an AI world, as you can imagine. And we're doing a little bit of statistics checks. So basically, you know, are the statistics, so we mandate posting of raw data or source data now. So we have a look if the data that underlies the graphs is remotely related to the graph that's presented. Is there any statistic presented at a very, very simple, banal level? And we're trying to find mechanisms, so tools, basically AI-based tools, to do sort of accounting forensic approaches to see if the statistics were done properly. We had a case just last week where the Excel files, so the graph looks completely fine. The Excel files underlying the graph had basically second, third decimal place copy-paste issues, which is a classic telltale sign of fraud. You know, basically the numbers were just invented because they used the same 0 and 5 in the third decimal place. So those are the kind of level of stuff that we do, and it's quite a bit of work. But we find a lot of cases, that's the problem. And you know, when Tobias says this is not third-party stuff, we find the problems. I mean, that's the issue. So we could stop it, but then they would all be published.
Well, I mean, it's completely within your job as a publisher to spend as much effort as you reasonably can to prevent made-up publications to be put out under your journal name. That's the reputation of your journal in the end. And when it comes to the grantees and researchers, the SNSF never sanctioned any researcher for not complying with the open access requirement. We do not plan to do so in the future. Also, in theory, we could. The SNSF does sanction grantees that commit fraud and manipulating images, making up data, publishing falsified results. That's definitely fraud, and that is risky. That's not just a sanction by the SNSF, that's putting your career on the line if you want to continue working in academia. So that's something that is, I don't want to say taken care of, but that carries a very inherent risk for anyone who wants to stay within academia and also beyond. So this kind of quality assurance, applying as many methods as you can to find fraud or issues someone had when preparing an image. I mean, that's a broad scale and there's a gray area. That's something one expects for any publisher that takes money to put a publication out, I would say.
So maybe we can come back, like before we end the session, actually, to a question about the cost. And this is a question from the audience, and I will show the question from Urs Jenold that asked Bernd, so what actually keeps journal from being less selective, if this makes sense on the business side? And I guess, Shawnna, you can also answer this question.
Yeah, she's run away. No, so, yeah, definitely. I definitely wanted to answer that too. So, you know, Urs, that's exactly. So that's a very interesting question. I try to sort of articulate that we still feel that's a valuable service, and importantly, it's a service beyond the proxy service to the research funders for making selections. You know, this is not a good enough reason for journals to exist. And Shawnna said if she loses her jobs because of that, that's life. I do firmly believe we're still adding value in this selectivity. We do beyond that. You know, with this whole coffee room discussion we had earlier, that we're trying to enable browsability of science. So we want young researchers to find information that they didn't expect to find and they would never find through keyword-based searches. That's really, if you only do keyword-based searches, you will find stuff in your own domain and you will never be surprised, really. You need to stumble across stuff, which you could do at conferences. That's one way, that's one mechanism that's important. But I think journals have that function. So you open, you know, you're meant to read stuff that you wouldn't have found otherwise. Now, this doesn't apply to all 35,000 journals that we have, by the way. And that's why we had this discussion. I don't think we need 35,000 journals. But I think it's good to have a small number of journals that are doing that type of enrichment. But it's open for discussion. So over to you, Shawnna.
So I think, again, it comes down to author choice and what authors want out of a journal, and if they want a high impact journal or not. The other thing is, you know, why don't we just publish 8 million papers if we can get $5,000 for each paper we publish. And that comes down to the reputation of the journal. I think that's one of the reasons that authors come to us, is it's not just about the impact, it's also about the reputation of the journal. They know that we publish good, solid science with a new biological insight. They know that as much as we can, we use all the tools that Bernd talked about to avoid problems with research integrity. And I think that's important for the reputation of the journal. And that's a huge driver for our submissions. And we could publish everything we get submitted, but then eventually we'd stop getting submissions because people would say, you're publishing all this garbage, you no longer serve my need as being a journal that's showing me the stuff that I want to read. So now we do offer journals across the realm, and Springer Nature that owns EMBO now, they do the same, right? And that's how we balance the cost of these selective journals, is by publishing journals like Helion or Scientific Reports. Yeah. I hope that answered the question.
Just a quick correction. They don't own EMBO at all. They're service provider to EMBO.
Oh, sorry. I think one thing I wanted to get back to was super interesting when you said earlier that one of the reasons you went to become have a partnership with a publisher, is that the right way to say that? A for-profit publisher, was because they have these mechanisms for APCs and dealing with that. And I'm sure a lot of societies are facing that. And I think that kind of concerns me, right? Like, I don't want the monopoly of publishers to continue. Yes, I work for a big publisher, but I see the value of societies. And I love ASCB, Cell Bio, like it's, I support that society, and I wouldn't want MBOC to be eaten up by a publisher. So I think that's super interesting. Bernd, do you see that as the future of publishing, where a lot of societies are going to be kind of pulled into these big publishers because open access is complicated to deal with that, taking payment for it. We've only just figured it out recently at Elsevier.
Yeah, no, I think that's such a good comment, and I'm really glad that you made it. It's really important, because, and we made this comment also quite prominently at several Plan S meetings. Basically, the risk with the whole open access model that we have is that it's driving independent small academic publishers into the hands of the big commercials, because it's so complex to administer the whole charging mechanism. I mean, we talked a bit about the global aspects here. And the hope was, of course, for open access to make it simple and transparent, to actually go the opposite direction, to help independents become more independent. But currently it's going the opposite way. At some point it may equilibrate, that all countries have a sort of similar mechanism of agreements, but right now it's a complete mess, and we would drown without the big commercial support that we get, which is awkward.
Thank you. So since we are arriving at the end of our session, I will ask a last question, but I ask you to be brief. It's like a yes or no question. So given all the discussion we had now and your experience in the field, do you think that in 5 years from now, all journals will be open access? So we can do a roundtable, and you just give me a brief answer. You have to take a stand now. Tobias, yes, you can start.
95% plus a measurement error.
Okay, I like that, yes.
Yeah, I'm backing up Tobias, because to say no would be very defeatist in this environment. I think we have to aim for this.
Do we mean gold open access? Just a
Yes.
clarification question.
Yes,
okay.
I mean gold.
I know it's yes or no. I'm not starting any. Okay. All right, I'm going to back up to Tobias too then.
Okay, so let's say 95%.
Peer pressure.
All right. Okay. I will give some concluding remarks then. Let me just see if I can gracefully share my screen. Okay. So, sorry, I didn't pull it off. All right. Okay, so I would just like to thank everybody for attending today, especially our panelists, but all of our participants as well, of course. And we hope that we have met our goals of helping you develop a better understanding of complying with the open access standards, understanding the financial side of open access publishing, and how open access publishing affects your work. And just to give you a heads up, we're going to send out an email to everyone who attended with a link to a post-event survey. We'd really like to know if this event was valuable to you and whether it affected your attitudes toward open access. So thanks in advance for giving us that feedback. And then in addition, just a reminder that we're going to be having a second session a week from today on October 25th. You can use the same link that you used today to join. And the program is going to cover innovations in scientific publishing. So there were some references today to things like a community review and that kind of thing. And so we'll cover those issues more in depth in that session, as well as changing the incentives, which was mentioned many times today. How can we replace the impact factor with other indicators of research quality and research outputs? And finally, I would just like to acknowledge our colleague, Anne-Cecile, who has been providing technical support throughout the event. So thank you very much for your help. And then also our organizations, the NCCR Microbiomes and Anti-Resist, for supporting us in putting on this event. And last but not least, the Swiss NSF for financial support.
So thank you all, yes, and we hope we will see you next week, next Wednesday at 2 p.m. Thank you.